So good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure to greet you today. My name is Antonina. I'm a senior consultant of leadership and talent consulting practice. Today, RosExpert we see our role as a bridge between everybody. We understand that currently it's quite a complex context in which companies plan, make decisions, and pursue their goals. And it takes all the creativity and it takes all diverse thinking in order to succeed. So today we've invited several global experts. We have Neda and myself joining from Russia. We have Paul and Raul who joined us from United Kingdom, and we have John all the way from Switzerland. So today we want to talk about one of the approaches that we think might help to facilitate thinking about how organization can transform to perform. And here we want to focus on strategic workforce planning, as we believe the structure of the personnel, its quantity and its quality may not only affect and help, the decision, and it may not only affect how company will return from their remote mode, but also to set up, the strategic plans for coming years. So one organizational moment, I of course encourage you to ask questions. You may use question and answers section or just simply write it into the chat. We will try to pick some of the questions if we have time, but we absolutely promise to capture all the inquiries, in our follow-up communication after the webinar. So thank you so much for joining in. We know currently it's hot time in Russian business, so we appreciate your time and your visit here. And Neda, thank you so much for joining. Please, the scene is yours.
Thank you very much, Antonina. Good morning, everybody. It's my pleasure to welcome all the participants from our side. And Antonina and the team, thank you especially for spotting this need in the market and being so fast and efficient in organizing this event, because I think that it's indeed worth to talk about this topic today in this changing environment. Talking about this workforce planning and especially strategic workforce planning. Well, in fact, in Korn Ferry, Russia, we started to talk about this topic already quite some time. But as every important and, let's say, more or less complex topic needs its own time. And I think nowadays when, everything is changing, starting from lifestyle and ending with the global revision of the global supply chain, the way how companies should plan their workforce probably should change as well. And it's interesting enough that in Korn Ferry we had global surveys just starting from the beginning of the lockdown. And our aim was to find out how companies are responding to COVID-related crisis, and most of all, what they are planning to do after the COVID will be over. And interesting enough that two clear trends appear to be repeating in all three surveys. And namely, one of them is that companies for sure are willing to continue to work more virtually after the COVID. And the second one, the companies want to operate with more flexibility towards people-related costs. And yeah, of course, to be disciplined with the cost management. Yeah, there are some other topics, but they are rather the derivatives of these two key trends. And basically, if we elaborate a little bit on these two themes, we understand perfectly that working virtually, it doesn't mean only placing people somewhere, for example, working at home. This in fact, covers quite some aspects of people management, starting from performance management, placing in the right geography, making the choice which jobs have to work remotely, developing people, rewarding people, teaming up, etc., etc. And the similar is towards the cost. It's not only that you decrease the fixed cost and increase the variable part. Is also, yeah, whom you give bonuses, whom you cut costs, etc., etc. We can continue, and basically we will arrive to key fundamental questions that every company has to answer within this context. It's about how many people do we want to work in our company, how our company should look like in terms of shape, how many managers we need to have, how we will structure our organization, where we will place those people geographically, what kind of skills and knowledge these people need to possess in order to perform, and of course, in the end, how much will it cost. Of course, these questions are just the questions, but the difficulty comes that when we talk about the strategic workforce planning, especially, we have to answer those questions simultaneously. And the challenge here is not only conceptually, but also instrumentally. And the good news here is that there is a solution. And here I would like to give a word to our global expert, Korn Ferry Global Head of Strategic Workforce Planning Expertise, Paul Lambert, who will talk more about the solution. So Paul, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Neda, and a warm welcome to everybody. I can see more people have joined in just the last couple of minutes. So I'm Paul Lambert. I lead our Strategic Workforce Planning and Analytics group globally. And I just want to take us a step back as we look at this quote on the next slide, which is, this is not the first time in history that we have faced difficult times, or there has been what people would call a crisis. This is a quote from Confucius from 500 years before Christ. The humane do not worry, the wise are not perplexed, the courageous have no fear. And as we think and as you prepare in your own businesses for both now and for the future, if we are well prepared, if we have the ability to play out different scenarios for the future, then we would like to suggest that you will be in a much better position. So let's have a look at that paradox. We've been working with a number of organizations around the world actually through this crisis and to help them. So obviously this is a massive health crisis, but it's also, as you all know, an economic crisis. People are worried about a short-term question, which we've called the liquidity question. Can I stay in business? Have I got enough money to pay all the people in the workforce? And you're having to make some rapid choices often about redeploying people. In the UK, we are putting quite a lot of people on furlough, which means the government pays them effectively for a few months, or people are finding new services. So there's that first question about, can we stay in business? But it needs to be held in tension with, can we sustain our business? So you will no doubt have seen the news with many of the airlines. People obviously are, I was talking to Air France recently, and they're only flying 5% of their planes at the moment. But they could make the choice to let lots of pilots go. Clearly, in the long term, that's not a good choice. So there are these two questions in tension, and it's important that we, as leaders, make the right choices about what we do with our workforce now, so we stay in business, what we do in the long term, so we can sustain the business. And let's just look at that uncertainty. Here are three key views of how long this COVID will impact us and impact the economies around the world. This is similar all across Europe, through Russia, At first, I think people were quite hopeful, and they talked about the rapid recovery, what people call the V shape there, where they hoped that this would be just a downturn for 2 or 3 months, and then a recovery over 3 to 6 months. In truth, I think we see that a lot of the economies are more like the second, the weak recovery, what people call the U shape quite often. There's a sharp downturn that's taking more like 6 months, and people expect the effects to be with us for another year after that, with revenue down 30%. But there is always the danger that it is even more prolonged. It does what people would call structural damage to the economy, and the downturn lasts for 6 to 12 months and a longer term recovery. The important thing is, though, that the better prepared, the more we scenario plan and the more we use data to inform this, the better the choices we make. So we want to run through a little bit of those examples in a second, but let's just think about the language that we use. How can you describe what's going on? We use this language, and we find clients often like to talk about their workforce across the 5 rights. So this is a way of describing the workforce now and in the future. So first of all, size. During this crisis, quite a lot of people want to reduce the number of people who are working because the amount of work has gone down. So the size goes down, the capacity of your workforce. But that may not be the size that you want to stay at as you come through the curves that we've just seen. So size and making sure that the capacity in the workforce is right for the work is an important consideration. But as we'll see in the case study that Raul's going to take us through in a second, the skills required as we work virtually, as we work in a more digitized world, as people don't choose to not necessarily come back to an office, but actually work in a digital way, they need new skills. How do you relate to customers when you're not with them? How do you operate through technology, etc.? So there's new skills required. There's also choices about the site. When we talk about that, what locations? Do you keep all your current locations open? Where are you going to keep staff? So we are already helping, we're actually helping one part of our government to think about, they have had lots and lots of tax offices. Do they need to keep all of those open if they're working with people remotely? So you can think about sites, there's great savings there. And we've talked implicitly about spend, the cost of the workforce. So how much does it cost to employ the people, depending on what kind of workforce you have, and whether you furlough staff or choices you make about reward. What is the spend? Can you afford it? Can you still make a profit? And that will depend lastly on the last dimension of the 5 rights, the shape. So many employers at the moment are looking for more flexibility and agility through the use of contingent workers, through the use of joint ventures or partnerships, or even employees from the so-called gig economy, those individuals that want to work independently. So this is hopefully a useful language that you can use in your own businesses across the 5 rights. So what are those choices? Let's have a look at this next slide, where you've got choices, and the important thing about this slide is some of the choices you've got can be done in the short term, but some take longer term choices. So it's the right blend or mix of these that will deliver often some of the savings or some of the improvements in your cost and your workforce. Let's have a think about some of those short term ones. I'm sure many of you on the call are aware of getting more of your employees to work from home. We're all sitting in front of a Zoom call now. So more people during this period have certainly homeworked. And in the medium term, we can then think about, do we keep more remote and hybrid working? What does that mean in terms of savings of offices? There's other choices though, pay freezes, pay delays, job furloughs. We've done what we call cost reduction workouts with businesses just to identify some of the areas where they can save costs, often by reducing the cost of supporting the frontline workers. So concentrating on the frontline workers and reducing their support costs. But then there's some of the longer term choices which will enable you and the people leading the business to structurally and long term save costs and make better use of your assets. That might be selling one of your businesses. That might be automating some of the work, as we'll hear Raoul talk about in a second. Or it may even be, as we've seen in a couple of clever cases, people acquiring other complementary businesses and getting the economies of scale there. So there's a number of choices. How do we make the right choice? Well, let's just look at two or three examples now of where we've helped people to do that and then what they've managed to do as a result. If you look on the right-hand side of this slide, it's about an Asian airline. They had a high cost structure. They were working in a fairly traditional way. Good service on their airlines, but relatively expensive tickets. And about 5 or 6 years ago, they came to us and they said, well, we need to operate in a different way. We need to save cost, but still fly people all around the world. And we need to do it in a cost-effective manner. So we used strategic workforce planning, some scenario planning, to look at how they could better run, what costs were right, and how better to run a low-cost airline. And they've had a $600 million turnaround plan, which has been enabled by this. If we look on the left here, this is actually our UK rail network. They are going through the once-in-a-lifetime change. This is, I'm sure you will see this on the Russian railways, signals to control the trains. We are gradually, we are planning to get rid of all those and replace it with mobile telephone type technology from control centers. This promises that they will get 40% more trains on the tracks because of the more precise control. But this program was going to take 25 to 30 years. The key constraint was the digital engineers that they needed to bring forward this change and plan this change, and the project and program managers. We modeled a different way of doing this, training new engineers and training new project managers and scaling the approach rapidly after the first 5 years, which reduced the time by over 10 years. That is a multi-billion-pound saving. So you can see the impact of this approach is significant, both in terms of the workforce and in terms of cost. So let's turn to today's real-life case study. This is actually happening as we speak, and my colleague Raoul is working with this client. So let me introduce it, and then I'll hand over to Raoul. So this is a multinational retail bank operating in over 28 countries. And we were already working with them, actually looking at how they can reduce, how they can shift from local branch network. So people come in, they pay in their money, or they acquire financial services over the counter, to a more digital based service. So calls, phoning up their bank or doing things online were part of the choices, but they also, as many of these countries became more sophisticated, wanted more sophisticated services. So this was going on. We were helping them to plan and model this, and COVID came along. So we were able to model the impact of those curves, and you'll see in a second that Raoul will show you the impact of those three curves that I talked about, the V, the U, and the L. So we were able to model that on top of some of the strategies, so they could make the right choices in the midst of the crisis and beyond. And with that, I will hand over to Raoul, first of all, to tell us a little bit of that story, and then actually show us some of the modeling. So Raoul, over to you.
Thanks, Paul. So before I go into the actual modeling tool, I'm just going to show you a quick slide. to show you some of the early insights that we produced as part of this project. So first of all, in terms of context, as Paul said, we were essentially looking at a number of different strategies being executed pre-COVID. One of them was a shift away from branch banking towards what they call voice branches, which is essentially call centers. So those branch sizes were going to reduce, and also the number of branches was also aimed, was planned to reduce over time. The second element was a shift towards digitalization, and by that they meant essentially taking those voice branches and increasing digital transactions. So moving away from traditional based transactions of cashiers and tellers towards digital transactions. And then the third element was what they call their universal banking program. So this is essentially reskilling their workforce to make better use of more advanced capabilities. So taking people that are traditionally in transactional type roles and reskilling them to become universal bankers, or people that are able to work in an advisory capacity, selling solutions across multiple different areas to the same clients. So broadly speaking, what we were expecting was a shift down. So demand was going to fall in terms of branch-based banking over time, incrementally, and virtual universal type roles were going to steadily increase. And one of the first effects that we saw from talking to people in the business and modeling this in the tool was actually certain strategies were being decelerated and other strategies were being accelerated. So it wasn't really about reinventing the wheel, coming up with this whole new bold strategy. It was about taking what you've already got, things that are already in motion, and deciding whether it's a good course of action to accelerate that or to decelerate it. So taking, for example, the branch-based banking, there was a huge shift towards remote working, which is a given, but also it made a lot of sense to actually start closing down the branches. There was a number of different factors here, namely it's quite difficult to manage distance in branches, but also the number of transactions fell dramatically. So in order to make up for the fall in demand, that was one of the actions that they decided to take. And to make up for that, so to balance your costs and stay in business, those key short-term decisions, there was a huge uptake in virtual or voice-based transactions and roles. So rather than dialing that up incrementally, there was a quick burst, and then there was a longer-term strategy of developing that further. So just to show you what that looks like in the tool, so I'm going to just switch over to the Dynaplan software. So this is a software that's built by Dynaplan. It's a tool that essentially is designed to do nothing else but strategic workforce planning very elegantly and beautifully, and it's very intuitive and easy to use. So we like to use it as often as we can. And what we're looking at here is effectively your dashboard. So I'm just going to help you to orientate first, and then I'll start to talk about the story in a bit more detail. So the graph you'll see in the top left and then the top right will be quite familiar to you. That is your supply versus your demand. So you've got your supply in the orange area here and demand in gray. And that essentially is an FTE headcount. So you're looking at your future workforce and where they, what your expectations are in terms of your future workforce, and that's balanced against your current workforce. So the projection of how it's going to pan out over time. And the key thing that you're looking for here is changes in the nature of that workforce. So for example, I've mentioned a movement away from advisory type roles to more, a movement away from transactional based roles towards more advisory based roles. So you'll see a fall in demand in those transactional roles and an increase in demand for those advisory type roles. So to help orientate you in terms of the left and the right, in the left we're looking at short term, so in months, and the right we're looking at the long term. And this is quite helpful as a guide, because obviously when we're planning, so when we're applying changes and seeing the effect, it's quite useful to have a a lens that looks really purely at the short term. So you can see how the consequence of those actions in the short term, and you can see the consequences of those actions in the longer term. So though, for example, taking the example that Paul gave, if you're Air France and you decide to reskill or exit a certain number of pilots, that might work for you in the short term. You'll redress the surplus, but actually in the longer term, you might not necessarily be in basically be able to compete against your competitors due to your lack of pilots. So coming back to this example, in the bottom, this is the link between workforce planning and financial planning. So what we took here is we've given some numbers from the business in terms of their target, their revenue target, or the sales targets month on month, and we've also used a projection, a sales estimate from the tool. So what we're seeing here is generally against the target, because of COVID, the sales are expected to fall, and then there's a sort of a steady increase. Sorry, the labeling on this is incorrect. So that this is the sales estimate, this is the sales target. So essentially, what you're expecting is they're expecting a shortfall in the short term and some sort of recovery in the longer term. In terms of this bottom view, so one of the other effects of COVID is obviously the healthcare crisis. So you can't look at it without looking at the impact on your employees. And a direct consequence is obviously people getting sick, being off work, some people for short term, other people for longer term, and indirectly as well. So other people, so supporting those that have been ill, having to self-isolate, not being able to get into work, or just being unavailable. So we looked at essentially an absenteeism within your workforce. And the effect that has is obviously, well, it reduces your surplus, but overall, but in certain roles where actually there isn't necessarily a surplus, or there might be in fact a deficit, it creates a ripple effect, because effectively, if you've got a role, you've got positions for 10 people, and you've got 10 people fulfilling those, 1 week to the next, and then suddenly 2 of them become ill, you effectively have to schedule another 2 people. So your demand increases overall. So rather than having demand for 10, you have a demand for 12. So it creates a bit of a ripple effect in the organization. So just showing you how this works, I'm going to scroll back to 0. So what we're going to do is just going to go 1 month at a time. So as you can see, as I'm hitting this button, it's starting to complete the picture. So what we're seeing overall here is, this is the medium impact, and I'll look at the others in a second. What we're seeing is there is an increase in absenteeism. Absenteeism has peaked and is now starting to return to normal. Sales have come down versus the target, and they're starting to recover. So there's the peak in absenteeism and the sales fall tend to align themselves. So you're expecting a massive fall in transactions and a recovery within about a year's time. So if I compare this with low, so this was something that we looked at with this client very early in the year. So we were sort of thinking, well, Asia's a long way away. This obviously is having a ripple effect, but controls were quite tight, and it shouldn't necessarily have a huge structural effect on the market. We'd expect there to be some sort of revenue fall if and when there's a lockdown. So this was sort of pre-lockdown, and what we saw was actually the number of transactions fell dramatically because we were entering into a period of financial instability. Essentially, people weren't entering into banks and actually making those transactions. So we were seeing the transactions fall. We were expecting them to fall at the very lowest around April, May 2020, and then obviously recover quite quickly. Also, we looked at the number of absenteeisms due to COVID, and that was at around 12%. So broadly speaking, what we were expecting was a fall in transactions of 10%, absenteeism due to COVID at 12%, and then quite a fast recovery, and all was forgiven. So it was quite, obviously we ended up with a bit of a surplus situation at the beginning, but things were quite easily redressed. If I compare that, go back to the medium or the U curve. This, as we entered into the beginning of Q2, this started to look like a much more realistic scenario. So as we were building the model, we were talking to people in the front line, division leaders, branch managers, actually using real data to kind of understand the impact. And what we were seeing is, first of all, they had decided to close further branches. So they'd reduced the size of those outlets. They'd actually closed more branches. So they've gone from 33% branch closures to another 15% branch closures, and they didn't plan to reopen them until later in the year. So that had a huge effect in terms of demand. But also we saw an increase in absenteeism. So absenteeism actually started to peak a bit later, but at about 20%, so quite a significant proportion of the workforce. So you ended up with this huge surplus in the short to medium term. And then we sort of thought, well, okay, well, we might need to plan for a worst case eventuality. And this is looking, this is as bad as it can get. So this is the L curve. We're talking about a global recession, major permanent structural damage, all of the branch closures effectively becoming permanent. So those branches have reduced in size. The branches have overall reduced by 50%, and they're remaining closed. Only a very, very small proportion of them are starting to reopen. So obviously this creates a huge effect in terms of a surplus, and you end up essentially with almost twice the workforce that you actually need. So that obviously leads to very high turnover. And this reflects about 40 to 50% fall in transactions. And obviously with that, there's a huge increase in absenteeism, up to 40%. So you have too great a workforce, the wrong kind of workforce, and lots of absenteeism. So it's really a worst case eventuality. So, well, this is all well and good. It's helpful to look at the risks and issues to better understand where the business is suffering. Something that's also quite useful is understanding how to redress it. So the reason that we looked at the worst, medium, and best case is so that we can plan against them, create a set of scenarios that will hopefully redress some of those balances. So to put this into context, I'm going to look at, I'm going to focus on those transactional roles. So these are cashiers, tellers, people that work at front of house, that welcome the customers, talk to people in queues and organize them. So they're quite transactional in nature. They sell one or two products. And they're effectively being transitioned out, and advisory type or universal banking roles are being transitioned in. So they represent the workforce of the past, and we're trying to move them towards the workforce of the future. So one of the first things that we saw was, in terms of that workforce and how they were being impacted, was an increase in digital-based transactions. So those digital-based transactions, month on month, were actually increasing by up to 8% following the shift towards remote working. So just to reflect the effect that has. So obviously you've seen demand has effectively fallen further, because for every transaction you need less people. Each individual, each FTE is able to perform more transactions because they're now more digital and more productive in nature. As a consequence of that, sales has gone through the roof. So sales has actually started to really pick up, which is very helpful. But at the other side of that is there is a change in the nature of the customer interactions. So rather than the customers coming in and taking out mortgage applications or looking for short-term loans, they're actually coming in for financial support. So this is obviously having an effect on everybody, not just the bank. So we're seeing a massive increase in terms of customer support inquiries. So to reflect that, I'm going to change that to 6%. So that's what we saw, month on month increase in terms of customer support. So you see that actually demand has started to pick up again. So there's actually, it's fallen due to an increase in productivity, and it's increased due to a different type of need, which is more around customer support. So, okay, so we've got that. We still end up with a surplus overall, but it's reshaped the demand profile. So we need to look at, okay, well, let's try and look at the strategies that are already in motion, the ball that's already rolling, and see if we can, you know, basically build on that. So the first thing we're going to do is going to take that universal banking program, and we're going to add 2%. Sorry, wait for that to load. Add essentially 2% per quarter. So 2% of people in transactional-based roles are being reskilled. Oops, just going to adjust that. 2% of people are being reskilled to work in more of an advisory capacity. Sorry, just bear with me. I've got a lot of thinking to do this model. There we go. One more. Perfect. Okay, so we still end up with, overall, you can see that that profile is a bit more in line with what we're looking for, but we still end up with a problem. We've still got a very short-term surplus issue. And there's a couple of ways you can go about this. Typically, what we're seeing is organizations are trying to do more with less. They're trying to reduce turnover. They're asking people to make salary sacrifices, reduce their hours, and make the most of the schemes that are available. One of those schemes is the furloughing scheme. So if I put that into perspective, so let's say, so here I'm applying essentially a furloughing scheme of 15% of the workforce is going to be furloughed for 6 months. And the effect that has is it immediately reduces cost and reduces that issue around surplus. So you end up with a workforce which is more or less in line with your demand. So essentially all of these different actions form part of what we call scenario planning. And the intention behind this, the end game, if you will, is to essentially find a number of different ways of addressing the same risks and issues. That essentially, you say that as a scenario, and that becomes one of your contingency plans. And so what we've actually done with this bank is for low, medium, and high, we've developed 3 different ways, 3 different scenarios of addressing all the risks and issues across all of the different job clusters and locations. And we've compared those against each other, and we've picked the best one. So we end up with a contingency plan for low, contingency plan for medium, and contingency plan for high. And we've essentially turned that into a resourcing strategy with indicators that can help them to identify which economic impact profile they're sitting in. So that if there is a second wave, they know that, okay, the second wave looks like a low, a medium, or high, and they're able to adopt some of the strategies that we pulled out of that scenario planning stage. So I'm going to hand over back to Paul just to talk through some of the outcomes from that exercise.
Raoul, thank you. There's nothing like actually seeing this, and you can see the power of being able to literally in 5-10 minutes work through a strategy live. So here's, as Raoul hinted, there's some very powerful outcomes come from this. One is they've managed to continue their strategy but speed it up. So they've accelerated the closure of branches, brought on board the digitalization program, but they've also managed that customer service by putting different arrangements in place and more effort into some of those virtual transactions, and shifted more of the day-to-day workforce. They're often doing cashier type roles into providing the core financial advice that people need. So what they've managed to do is both improve customer service and reduce costs and work through this COVID period. So Raoul, let's just reflect now and reflect with John on the power of the ability to look at scenario planning and planning for the future using this data and this type of approach.
Thank you, Paul. And I think we saw in his demo how Raoul illustrated on one hand the complexity of the problem we are facing, but also how easy and quick was to explore scenarios in the planning tool. At the end, Raul ended up with a set of HR measures that would help the company on one hand stay liquid and solvent as well. But why is technology important in this context? Well, what we saw so far is that we have interacting dynamics taking place. On the one hand, we have the business dynamics, starting from the impact of the pandemic in multiple aspects of the business, but also the ongoing business initiatives, such as digitalization and reorganization that are still taking place and in execution. On the other hand, you have the workforce dynamics. People are being impacted by the pandemic as well. People are being laid off, becoming absent. Even some people are being hired. And all these factors interact simultaneously to create quite a complex problem. Unfortunately, what we see is many organizations tackle these challenges using Excel or trying to use their operational ERP systems, which are really designed for operational problems, but ill-suited for strategic planning. So here is where Dynaplan can make a difference. Our SWP solution is designed from the start for complex and strategic challenges. So let's look at some differentiators. First, our powerful simulation modeling feature allows us to capture complexity that is specific to your business. So you don't use just a generic suite, but a solution that is tailored and customized to your business model and your challenges. Second, our dynamic closed-loop model for decision support helps you not only identify future risks, but also test possible options, possible decisions, and simulate them in the decision tool, as Raul did, before actually going into implementation. Also, you have a quick start. Our out-of-the-box model compiles more than 15 years of experience in workforce planning and allows you to start from the beginning with a comprehensive set of drivers that will give you value from time zero. Also, it is important to understand that this is not a complex, large-scale IT implementation, but it's a lean installation that you can do basically in minutes. It's important, the scenario concept. When we analyze complex problems, there is no crystal ball that will show us a single future. So what can we do? What we can do is to explore alternative scenarios, like the low, medium, and high set of scenarios that Raul showed us, and analyze them together with our team and converge into a set of solutions that will help us prepare better for the future. Finally, multi-stakeholder engagement is important. Strategic planning is not an exercise only for HR. It needs to involve finance and business as well. And our collaboration features allow you to do precisely that in a very user-friendly way. So in summary, this technology combined with the expertise of our partners make no doubt a great combination to help you navigate this complexity. Thank you, Paul. Back to you.
John, fantastic examples. You've said many of the things I wanted to say to our audience today about the differentiators of this approach. It makes me recall a time when we were working with the leaders of the digital railway program in the UK, and we had them all in a room, and they used to spend days and days planning things, and we literally clicked some buttons, and we said, what if we did this? What if we did that? And we made choices. But it illustrates the first point, I think, that you get powerful insights fast. What John didn't go on to say, but it's very true as well, is it's simple to scale. Typically, we work by working in a pilot area of your business to produce results in weeks and benefits there, and then it's simple to scale. The data, there's a rapid way in there of allocating your job data to our job families, which gives you insight through our talent hub into what are the core skills and capabilities for a job, how long does it take to move through those career paths, and therefore what are the options for your workforce. So it's based on insight. It requires a low resource input. As John said, it's literally out the box in terms of technology, and then we work in small agile teams. So the banking example, actually, John and Raul have been working with one other colleague and 3 or 4 people from the client, and within weeks getting some powerful results. We've also, there's a lot of data underneath these. A couple of points there. We've got a lot of data about the impact of COVID, and we've got a huge amount of data about jobs and job families, which are all part and parcel of this modelling. And lastly, again, as John said, this real-time scenario-based simulation. This isn't a days and a weeks in dark rooms. This is moments in with management teams, etc. And they can have access to this as well through their iPad into the modelling. So it's a powerful combination that allows management to make decisions quickly. So let's just leave you with a couple of hints and tips as Raoul shows this last core slide. But what can you do now? What can you do right now? Well, our advice would be there's four rapid steps which are enabled by this kind of approach and this kind of technology. You just need some key data about your people, not everything, but a baseline of your people, particularly those doing frontline roles. In the bank, that was the people doing the transactions, people giving financial advice, people providing some of the online services. And then there needs to be a reflection on what are critical organizational capabilities. We have frameworks and models to help you with that, but to really understand what roles will be important for the future of your business, will be critical roles, and which ones are hard to get hold of in the current market. That then leads you to what possible choices. In the example, Raoul gave you a wonderful example of taking people who had been cashiers and doing basic financial transactions and training them in some of the core financial advice to do what they called universal banking roles. But there were some choices about retraining, also some choices about furloughing. And it's all underpinned, lastly, by the kind of software that Raoul demonstrated from Dynaplan and John talked about the benefits of, to actually make that visible, clear, and those choices in a way that isn't stuck in lots and lots of data, but is visually impactful and enables business to make the right choices. So we'll close there. We're really keen to have your questions, but I'll hand back to our host today. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. Dear Paul, dear Nada, Raoul, John, it was a fantastic explanation. Thank you so much. So, dear participants, I encourage you to schedule a meeting with your team in order to have more details, to discuss it in the context that you are working now, to explore the challenges that your team is currently facing. So it might be a light version as like a short workshop for your leadership team while you explore these L, U, and V-shaped profiles, to understand, what would be the great tactical things to capture, what are the opportunities to grab, what are the risks, to consider while doing it, or you may dive deeper and explore, and reimagine your workforce planning and use the technology and the solution, in its all beauty and elegance. So please feel free to contact us. We are ready to discuss and, to see how things going for you. Thank you so much for attending today. Thank you everyone for your participation. And I see that we do not have questions, but as soon as you have them, please reach to us. We will be happy to assist. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day, everyone. And thank you for being with us today.